Emma Knighton, welcome to Psychedelics today. Super excited to have you here and surprised you haven't been on the show. I feel like you've been on the show before and I'm glad we were able to make it happen. So welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. So would love for you to introduce yourself to our listeners. Who are you? What's your background? How are you involved in psychedelics? Anything
Yeah,
that you really want to
absolutely.
share?
So my name's Emma Knighton. I use she and they pronouns. And professionally, I'm a somatic trauma therapist. I'm a psychedelic assisted therapist. I do a lot of education in the field of psychedelics, organizing, leadership, policy work. Have my fingers in lots of buckets in the psychedelic space. And a lot of that comes from a desire to see more trauma informed practices, more consent oriented practices in the field, wanting to steep things in a little bit more rigorous ethics and equity. And I really care about healing trauma collectively and individually. And so that's the root of where my work comes from. I've worked in a number of organizations in the past. I was the co-founder and the co-executive director of the American Psychedelic Practitioners Association. Don't work with them anymore, but that was a big labor of love for a long time. And work at a number of the training programs, Vital being one of them.
Yes. You are one of our instructors, and it's so lovely to have you part of our team. Yeah, you've been doing some really amazing work over the years, and I'm curious, how did you start to get involved in the psychedelic field and industry?
Yeah. So, I've been a therapist for about a decade, and that was my entry into the field. I completed the CIAS program for the Certificate in Psychedelic Assisted Therapies and Research in 2019. And that was, professionally my entrance into the field, and then got recruited to help start the APPA kind of randomly. Somebody asked me to come help direct things in terms of equity. And it just kind of took off from there. And I've done policy work and all over the place now. Personally, it's been a part of my life for a long time. And I'm somebody who was raised really in a pretty spiritual culture. And my mom and grandma, I like to joke that I was raised by a bunch of witches. That's definitely
Nice.
how it feels. And so
Yeah.
it feels like a natural trajectory for my personal and professional life to be pretty intersected with non-ordinary states. And it's just kind of taken off in the last couple of years.
Yeah, that's awesome. Did you ever think you would be working in the field of psychedelics or working with non-ordinary
No.
states?
In the field of psychedelics, no. I think non-ordinary states, it's been a part of my life for so long that
Yeah,
I don't know that it was ever a question of, am I going to work in this? And more of just, this is a part of who I am and how I work. Even as a
right.
trauma therapist, I feel like I work in non-ordinary states, even if there's no substances involved in some of those practices. And so kind of traveling around the dimensions has been something that I've done my whole life. And so it seems like a natural progression, but I wasn't like, I want to work in psychedelics. Like that was never a part of the plan.
Yeah, it just kind of starts to unfold as we were talking about a little bit earlier. When you're in this field, things just sometimes seem like the dominoes start to fall, and you're like, "What's going on? How did I get here?"
Yeah, I often say I feel like I'm picking my foot up and placing it, and I have no idea what the next step is gonna be until it materializes underneath my foot. And, it takes a lot of trust and surrender, and I'm slowly but surely getting used to that being the way that my life goes.
Yeah, yeah, awesome. So I know we wanted to chat today about consent, specifically in psychedelic and psychedelic work. So
Yeah.
could you tell us a little bit about your interest in this topic and why it's important, or maybe I'll use the pun here, why it's vital for psychedelics?
Yeah, yeah. So there's a couple different avenues to answering that question, and I'll start with my personal relationship to it, and then kind of carry us into how that looks professionally for me and why I feel it's important, and it's something that I'm championing in the field. Personally, I come from people who were survivors of cult trauma. People who were both my mom and dad were survivors of abuse from people with a lot of spiritual power. And it's interesting. I was actually doing this work of consent training in the psychedelic field before I put that together. And it was actually one of my own psychedelic experiences that helped me realize that this is something that I hold in my body and in my lineage. And it feels like a part of my family shadow, the ancestry shadow, and the field shadow that is my part of my work to help bring into the light and help clean up. And so from my own perspective, it's something that's really near and dear to my heart. There's, building off of that, I don't know any spiritual communities that don't experience some abuses of power. We're humans. We all have shadow. Every organization has shadow. Every lineage has shadow. And as long as humans have been around, there's been issues around violating boundaries, ethics, and how we hold power with each other and over each other. And, the psychedelic movement is not innocent of that. We know there's lots of cases of ethical violations, of touch boundaries being crossed, sexual boundaries being crossed. And so for me, it's a place that I feel really drawn. And I think that a big piece of that is because of my family history with it. So this all started, the first time I did a consent training was, I think, in 2019. It was right after actually I finished my CIS program, and they asked me and a friend to come back. And I was really loud in the program about consent and ethics. And they were like, well, do you want to come help make this better then? Because we're missing something and you seem to have an awareness of it. And so I pulled from experiences that I've had primarily in the kink community, and thinking, really knowing that the kink community are the masters of consent from my perspective. They've had to do so much work in a marginalized space around how to create a really trauma-informed, consensual setup in a relationship that includes often a power dynamic, especially if we're talking about BDSM structures, with very frequently non-ordinary states of consciousness present. Kink interactions frequently get into a non-ordinary state. And so it seemed like a really easeful transition of like, well, let's look at what are the practices here and how might these apply to psychedelic work. And so that's the one part of the framework that my training comes from. And then the other is actually from the sex work world. So I'm trained in part of the community around the Wheel of Consent, which is a framework developed by Betty Martin, who's a sex worker. And it really looks at like, how do we hold touch and consent in interactions between our bodies? And what does it look like to really peel apart giving and receiving? And how do we stay in right relationship with ourselves and with the person we're working with when we have these really suggestible states present? Yeah. So it's kind of the background, and then things have been built from there.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for sharing, your personal experience. And I didn't know that about you, of like coming from that background. And I also find it really interesting. There are a lot of people that I've been interacting with recently that have come from like religious and spiritual communities that have been in those dynamics, and finding maybe healing or like a new community in psychedelics. So I find that to be really, really fascinating. So thanks for sharing that. I'm curious, as you bring up, it does seem like a lot of the consent work has really kind of formed out of like sex work and the kink communities. And so what do you think like the psychedelic world can really learn from those communities around consent? And what lessons have you been pulling from those worlds?
Yeah, that's a good question. The first thing that comes up for me is that there's nothing inherently wrong with power dynamics. There's nothing inherently wrong with risk, and that and with different kind of interactions. And I think that the kink world and the sex work world have really grappled with that, of like, we're doing these things that much of society sees as bad or wrong or fringe or don't understand, or just demonize and criminalize in many cases. And yet we know that there's nothing inherently wrong with this. This is a beautiful exploration of being a human, of having bodies, of interacting with other bodies, and how do we make this safe enough? And that's something, safe enough is something I talk about a lot in my trainings. And I think that the psychedelic world has a lot of similarities there. The criminality of it, the marginalization of it, the history of a lot of harm, especially to specific populations, and the fact that there is an inherent risk in doing psychedelic work. We have no clue what is going to happen. And there's so many factors that we can't control, right? And yet we do it anyways. And so what I really think about is, through a consent model and through like a negotiation model in relationship, we ask the question, how do we make it safe enough to do this risky thing? How do we consent to the risk that is present? And that is a question that kink negotiation and sex work interactions have been grappling with for a long, long time. And I think it's the same question that we grapple with specifically within that facilitator client relationship where there is a power dynamic present and one person is under the influence and the other person isn't.
Yeah, can you go into that a little bit more when you said there's nothing wrong with power dynamics? And I wonder if you could just like expand on that.
Yeah, yeah, of that, there's nothing inherently wrong with it. It's that when that power is held in a place of power over instead of power with, or when there is a violation of the boundaries or an abuse of that power, that's where it becomes problematic. It's really about, Kylie Taylor talks a lot about right relationship with the power that we have. And so that's really what I'm talking about here of how can we hold that power in a way that is aligned, in a way that is open, transparent, consensual, so that we don't cross a boundary into abusing that power or creating harm with the person that we're sitting with. So saying that like having a power dynamic, that on its own is not the thing that's wrong or bad,
Right.
right? It's how we use it and how it flows through the people that are in the room.
Right. Maybe this is like a little bit of a less extreme example, but maybe here like a scenario that like I've bumped up against sometimes at retreats, right? So, you're mentioning safe enough, right? And I think sometimes safety can be so subjective, right? Because we could create such a physical safe place, but internally when somebody is feeling triggered, they might not feel safe, right? A lot of those triggers may come up and, taking in information from the environment and all that stuff. So then as a facilitator, like creating that space and trying to create that safety, and then also really kind of emphasizing this self-directed, inner-directed approach, like trying to give people agency of like, you know what you need.
Mm-hmm.
And then if somebody needs to go get fresh air and go outside, right? And then this power dynamic will sometimes come up and it's like, do we have the facilitator? Do we have enough people to actually maybe safely bring somebody out there? What's outside where there could be more things going on, which might, bring on more resources. And to some degree, it's like, as I'm hearing you, like nothing wrong with the power dynamic to try to keep this place safe and kind of setting up those rules. But then it gets really tricky sometimes when it's like, you're trying to give somebody agency in their healing. And then all of a sudden you're saying no, because there's like not enough resources to do something, or, there's other, folks, maybe, there's other things that are going on in the room that other facilitators might need to attend to. So yeah, I don't know any thoughts around like a scenario like that, or if you have any other scenarios.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think what you're speaking to is the importance of preparation, and that so much of the work that I teach is kind of housed in the preparation and then is played out in the medicine experience and the retreat and the integration sessions. Of that, it makes me think about something from the holotropic breathwork world, which I know you're steeped into, of that sense of safe enough to be unsafe, of that we want to create a container that's safe enough so that we can go into places that feel really unsafe. And that when that power dynamic is present in a situation like somebody wants to go outside and are there enough resources to do that? From my perspective, if you've prepared people well enough, that is a situation where then maybe they aren't surprised
Right.
with the response that happens. Doesn't mean they're going to like it, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that you're not going to have relational things to work through in the moment and probably afterwards. But to me, the key around this is, are we being trauma aware? Are we being trauma attuned in this process? Which means doing a lot of work on the front end to create the container so that that sense of surprise and shutdown that so often is a trauma, like makes trauma responses even bigger, we've protected against that, right? Can we bring as much known in ahead of time so we could talk about, okay, if someone needs to go outside, we will do that if we have enough resources present. If we don't, we might ask you to sit with this a little bit longer and be in the space, and we're going to try to attend to you earlier. In my experience working with a lot of trauma survivors and working with them, in this space for a while, is that people's nervous systems, when they know ahead of time, there's some part of them that remembers, even if they're deep in a medicine experience, some part of their body has internalized, okay, here's the setup of this container. Here's what I can expect. And I think just kind of trying to go through as many of those things as possible ahead of time, knowing that we're never going to be able to prepare for every situation. Sometimes we just have to roll with it.
Right.
But that it can help with trust and building that trust so that when that does happen, the participant is able to say, I trust these facilitators. We built the relational container that is safe enough to be unsafe right now. And so I'm going to sit with this and trust that they're going to come back, trust that they're going to tend to me. And without that level of preparation, whether it's in a retreat space or an individual space, I think what often happens is that people get triggered and then their trauma stories just project all over the place, which happens anyways, but to a degree where some part of them doesn't know that they can trust the people that they're working with, doesn't know that they can actually play out that trauma response if they need to run or they need to project something on the facilitator in a way that can be actually held so that they can go through that corrective experience. And I think a lot of the consent work is about that, of like, how do we create a container to let someone play something out in a way that is going to hold it so that they can come to a different resolution in their nervous system.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, that preparation is so important. And
Yeah.
like, yeah, it's interesting. Like whenever like I'm doing any sort of preparation, like this fine balance of like explaining worst case scenarios and not trying to spook people. And also just being realistic, right? Like sometimes these worst case scenarios arise, and that fine balance of like, how much informed consent do you actually provide, or how much psychoeducation do you provide to somebody?
Mhm. Yeah, it really depends on the person, I would say. I have my list that I go through with everyone, and it's part of the trainings that I do too. It's called the Trauma Attuned Consent Checklist. And a part of that is talking about things that are going to be really important to some people and other people are going to not care about at all, you know. But for me, it's actually about like, what are my boundaries as a practitioner of what do I need to have in the space between us for me to feel safe enough to consent to the risk of this thing.
Yeah. Do you have any examples from this checklist?
Yeah, yeah. So a part of it is talking about like identity power dynamics, and talking about how structures of privilege and oppression flow through my body, flow through the person's body I'm working with, and the space between us, like systemically, ancestrally, historically. And with some people, that conversation is really quick. With some people, that conversation is something that takes a long time, and there's layers to unpack. There's a really big piece that I work with, and this is probably the biggest part of the training that I do, is around practicing touch interactions ahead of time. And so I really encourage anybody doing this work to have a preparation session totally dedicated to practicing touch, if touch is on the table. Right. And we talk about hard boundaries and soft boundaries, and that's where a lot of the kink stuff comes in. And so if touch is a soft boundary, meaning, okay, we're okay for touch, but we're going to negotiate it. If touch is a hard boundary, it means it's off the table entirely. But if it's a soft boundary, we need to practice it ahead of time so that people's nervous systems and bodies start creating, what I refer to as a somatic map of what it's like to be in relationship with my body if I'm the facilitator. And we practice things like receiving, accepting, declining. We go through all sorts of scenarios of asking for touch, of me saying yes or no, of us negotiating, of them requesting it. Or we kind of go through the gamut or what of the different ways that we might interact in terms of touch in this session. And what it does is it lets me see how people react to that. And it also gives people an experience to see how I react to it. And almost exhaustive. I've never had a client where this hasn't happened. Stuff comes up, trauma
Mm.
comes up, internalized narratives around consent come up, right? We live in a compliance culture, not in a consent culture. And so most of us have not actually learned what it feels like to really be attuned to consent in our bodies. And so all sorts of stories come up for people during this process. And you want those things to come up while we're in the same space of consciousness,
Yeah.
right? Because once we're under the influence of something, we actually can't change consent once we've taken a substance. And so this needs to be consented to ahead of time when we're both in an ordinary state of consciousness. And I think the best way to do that is to actually practice, and use that to create more safety going in.
What would that look like in a group setting? Like, I feel like you could give a lot of attention, maybe individual, but can you practice that with a whole group, or do you just find one person to do an example and then that's for everybody in the group? Or are you doing that with everybody in the group,
Yeah, so
practicing?
group settings are definitely different than individual, right? Like there's a lot more space in individual
Yeah.
sessions to practice that. Negotiation, I think first you have to think about what are the group agreements around touch. and do that negotiation first. I think the most common one is that participants don't get to touch each other, just like a hard boundary around no one's touching each other that are participants. Sometimes there's room for that. If there is, I think you need more prep because we need to have deeper conversations what that looks like. But if that's not on the table, but facilitators might be touching, I would say that there needs to be at least some baseline interaction between the bodies that are going to be making contact, because we don't actually know how our bodies are going to react being touched by somebody until it happens. Most often it's fine, right? And there's cases where it's not. Many people have sexual trauma, physical trauma that comes up during these experiences. And, with most people having developmental age around 2 to 4 of consent education, we've got a pretty, young developmental sense of our own relationship to consent. And so I would say in a group setting, there needs to be at least some practice and conversation with it, in order to create just the base level of consent and safety for practitioners touching the clients.
Yeah. This is interesting. I mean, it just has me thinking about like how we do consent around body work and breath work
Mhm.
sessions. And there's been times where, I'm able to like maybe show people what that looks like and be
Yeah.
like the example and have like another facilitator help out. Obviously, we go over a lot of consent information around touch and talk about the ethics of the body work. But, it just has me thinking like, how could I maybe do this a little bit differently at
Mhm.
workshops? And it's tough to maybe do it in a big group, but how could we start to do this a little bit more, consensually and give
Yeah.
people practice?
Totally. And I've been in a lot of breathwork spaces, and so I've had those experiences too. And for me, even just, and I've seen this with other people, and I think this is a way that this framework could be applied, of even just having like a quick check-in, right? And like, okay, you're available for touch. If this person says I'm okay to be touched by the facilitators, just even a 5-minute conversation of like, which facilitator are you okay with being
Mm,
touched by? Which ones do you not want to be touched by? And the ones that you do, can we just have a quick check-in and like, can I just feel your body next to mine before we
mm,
know that there's going to be some kind of physical contact? And I think especially with like in the breathwork model with the sitter and the breather, that's a space where you can do more practice, right? Because there's more of a focused interaction there.
right.
But I think too, something to consider with group work versus individual is the sense of what's the container the person is consenting to when they're coming into a group experience. They're going to have less individualized care. There's going to be more of a need for self regulation, for them tending to themselves. There's going to be more risk, right, in a group space than there often is in an individual space. And that's, we could debate that, but there's more uncontrolled variables, right, in a group space.
Right.
And so that's part of what participants are consenting to. And so I think if anything, that's what needs to be talked about, of that there is more risk here. You are less, you know, quote unquote safe in this space than you might be if all the attention was focused on you. And so the consent conversation is, what's the risk here? Can we consent to it knowingly, openly? And what do we need to feel safe enough in order to go into that space where this risk is present? And that's different. Every situation is going to have a different level of risk depending on the people that are there. So the conversation is different in every setting.
Totally, totally. And just thinking about like risk and safety, like how do you approach this topic of safety and like what does safety even mean? How do we create
Yeah.
quote unquote safe spaces?
Yeah. So it goes back to the thing. I don't say this space is safe. I say, we're going to make this space safe enough to do the thing, whatever the thing is, safe enough to consent to the risk that is present, right? I don't actually think that safe period exists for anybody
Yeah.
anywhere. And so it's more about like, what does safe enough mean for each person? And that's facilitators and clients, because facilitators, we have our own boundaries, right? And if we're not attending to our boundaries, and if we step over one of our boundaries in service of somebody else, that container is now out of consent because we've crossed a boundary that we have. And so we have to think about, what is safe enough for me to be in this setting? And then what does safe enough look like for the person or people I'm working with? And how do we create that? And it's something that I love about this work, and something that the kink world and also the non-monogamy world has really taught me, of like, we get to create it. We get to
Mm,
decide, we get to negotiate these different factors. I believe there isn't one right way to do any of this. And really, it's a co-creation with all the people that are present.
Right. Yeah. Getting feedback, seeing what people consent to, how they can maybe feel safe in things. And then it's like negotiations, kind of like when we do group guidelines, right? It's like, hey, maybe these won't work. Maybe they will work. Please give us some feedback around it. I think our retreat organizer, Alice, always kind of used the term, maybe it's from Brene Brown, but courageous space.
Oh,
Because
yeah.
it does
Brave
take
space.
oh yeah, that's
Yeah.
it, brave
Yeah.
space. Yeah, because it does, right? It takes a lot of bravery or courage to show up in a space, be vulnerable, knowing that there's risks involved, but also trying to like trust it, even though there's sometimes factors that are out of our control, right? And to your point, when we're working with groups, we sometimes have no idea what's going to come up for somebody, right? And then to
Yeah.
have to like navigate all that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's, I would add in there is that something we have to be really attuned to, and this is what I named earlier as part of the checklist, is that safe enough looks really different for different people
Yeah.
and is so dependent on your personal trauma history, on your social location, on the amount of trauma that you're just exposed to by just having a body in the world, depending on what kind of body you have and how society interacts with your body. So many different factors, individually, collectively, systemically, ancestrally, all come into that. And so that's why, my opinion is that we need to be taking way more time to prepare individually and in a group setting to just have that curiosity of what does safe enough look like for all the different people of identities and abilities and experience in this group, and where is a spot where we can overlap and give people the autonomy to decide if they want to be there or not. And as people who have, if we're the facilitators, people who have the power in that space, of being really radically honest with ourselves of what kind of space can we hold and for whom
I
to
think
make
that's
it
so
safe enough.
important, right? Like knowing
Yeah,
like your scope of practice, your training, what
exactly.
you can do, you can't do. And I think, yeah, that takes a lot of self-reflection to be honest
Yeah.
with yourself and be like, actually, I don't know if this is, the right thing to be doing.
Hmm.
And I've had to do that in the past of like pulling back on some work because I've been so kind of, sucked into other stuff. I'm like, I just don't have the capacity to do this right now. And
Yeah.
it doesn't feel safe or ethical to even be trying to do it with folks.
Yeah.
Um,
Absolutely. Yeah. And the amount of work that we've done on ourselves, right? I think that anybody in this field knows that this work brings out your own stuff in a way that I don't think anybody's prepared for until you're in it. And
yeah.
so it's, like for me, like my own level of my work on my trauma personally, familially, collectively, systemically, that is going to be a part of the space that I'm able to hold. And that if a client is bringing something that activates something in me that I don't know or haven't tended to, that's going to create a space where some harm could happen. And so I think part of the consent process and part of being an ethical and accountable practitioner is being really honest around what do I know? What do I not know? And what do I not know that I don't know? You know, what is that called? Johari's window. I think there's another one that I
Mm,
missed. But that process is part of this too, and being able to communicate with the people we're working with, that we're a human too, and that our humanity is going to be in the room, and how we hold that matters.
yeah. And things happen, right? Like, sometimes we'll say harm happens and it might not be intentional, right? And it could be just not being aware of our own kind of scope, our biases, maybe our own kind of triggers. So as practitioners, like how do we then, I guess, like repair that with
Mm.
folks, and how do we
Mhm.
approach that? Because I think sometimes in the field we just like some folks just kind of brush it off.
Yeah.
And I think the most important thing is like how do we become a little bit more self-reflective and actually approach that and figure out how to do some repair there.
Yeah, that's a really big question. And to me, as a part of this whole consent conversation, of that part of creating the safe enough space is knowing that harm might happen. And part of being a safe enough person to work with is being able to lean into that rupture and repair process. So, in individual sessions, and part of the training that I do is that there's always a check in during integration sessions of how did this go? What came up? What do we need to work on? Is there repair that we need to look at? Are there ruptures that are repairable or not repairable? For me, I look at it through the lens of restorative justice and transformative justice, of seeing that when we look at the impact of our behavior rather than the intention and focus on how did this actually land in this person, and that when harm is done, if it's brought to us, that we're centering the person that experienced the harm in that process. And the first question really is this person wanting or open to repair, to engage in a repair process? What does that look like? And that for us as the people, the facilitator, the people in, the power position and the power dynamic in the relationship, that it's our responsibility to be willing to go into it and say, like, how did my behavior impact this person and cause harm in this way? And be willing to do our own work around it and know that that might not lead to repair with that person. And we are still responsible for doing that work because it will come up again with other people. And in that specific relationship, whether it's a student or a client or someone in a group or someone in the community, that's a process that's held with a lot of care, a lot of support, and a lot of like humility, right? We have to really humble ourselves in front of our humanity and the humanity of other people and the radical vulnerability that this work brings out, and knowing that our stuff will come up and we will harm people. And so I think that in terms of accountability, there's a preventative side to accountability and then a restorative, responsive side to accountability. And that a part of this work is doing the preparative accountability of how could I harm someone? Where are my hooks? Right? What do I know could draw me into a position where I might step over a boundary? I might kind of go towards an ethical gray area, and being really honest with ourselves ahead of time, having support and being clear on who we can and can't work with and where our lines are. And then knowing ourselves, practicing radical accountability with ourselves in session with clients, radical responsibility, self-care, all of those things, community care. And then on the other end, having a support set up for those processes, I think is really important. And I think that is something that actually our field is really lacking at the moment. I don't
Can you
think
say
that we
more about
have,
that?
yeah, I don't think that we have a accountability system set up in the field
Yeah.
yet. We have license boards and we have the punitive justice system that, in my opinion, doesn't work. And we haven't yet set up a different system for psychedelic facilitators. I know there's been efforts in the underground and in small community spaces. There's absolutely structures that are built. On a bigger scale, though, we don't have a community norm around what that looks like. And I think that part of the consent conversation is how do we hold this as a community when violations do occur? Because they have, and we've grappled with it as a community. And I don't think that we've actually found a good way to move forward that doesn't just replicate the punitive justice system that we've got now that, as I said, doesn't work and specifically oppresses certain groups.
I can imagine you've probably done some thinking around what a system would look like.
Have.
And, what would that look like to you?
Yeah, I mean, in my dream world of it, and what I would love to see born into our ecosystem and be a part of is one that follows the restorative and transformative justice model. I would love to see a space where if a client or somebody who's a participant in a psychedelic space experiences harm, that there is a place that they can go to report that is community based, of people that don't have conflicts, massive conflicts of interest with the person, with the facilitator, and that there's a supportive avenue that takes the RJ and TJ model of how to repair harm, and that person, I'll use the word client for ease, of that client is really supported in their process, that they have an advocate, that they know what their options are, that they're not afraid of retribution, and that there is empowerment in that process. This is idealized. There's lots of things that would have to be in place in order for that to happen. And it's also an iterative process. I think that we could do this and continue as we go. There's lots of models from different community organizing spaces that have put this into practice and works. But I think the biggest thing is really like, how do we create space for transformation and healing for individuals, for organizations? From my perspective, if we're going to say that we are practicing psychedelically rather than like doing psychedelics in business, like if we're actually doing business psychedelically, then we have to do something different that creates an avenue for clients, for practitioners, for organizations to have the chance to change and transform and do better and be better and have reparations and everything that comes with the RJ and TJ process. So I would love to see that implemented on small scale, because I think it needs to be, you know, just specific to each community, and there's
Hmm.
not going to be a one size fits all model. That's not how this works.
Right.
But if we can have small scale structures that are kind of housed under an organization that holds this on a bigger scale, I think that things could be helped.
For those that like maybe don't know too much about like restorative justice models, like could you give a brief little background around like what that looks like?
Yeah. So, well, I mean, an important thing to know here is that it really depends on the community. And that's, I think, part of the magic of it, of that communities get to decide what it looks like. I am not extensively trained in restorative justice or transformative justice. So I want to just be like really clear and upfront
Yeah.
about that. I do have some training in it, but I'm not an expert and I'm not a practitioner of these things myself. I'm a participant for sure and an appreciator of it. From my, the little knowledge that I have in terms of the training that I have in it, it's a framework that looks at how do we hold accountability and hold repair when harm has been done that is alternate to the punitive justice model. And so it looks like, how do we keep people in community instead of just this model of disappearing people, right? And it comes from primarily from Black movement spaces where the repair had to be done within the system because the external system was one that was specifically targeting Black communities, and especially in the social justice movement. And so looking at how is it held by the community, how are people brought together in a space where the impacted party is allowed to share their feelings, what happened for them, the impact of it. The responsible party hears that, receives it. There's a process of ownership, of apology, and of behavior change, and the process often of reparations. And that what those reparations are defined by the community that is brought together, and that it's never done in isolation. That's a really important piece of it. That there's witnesses present, there's community support present, and that it's, again, really unique to the specific community that's there and the people that are there, and centering the person, the impacted party's experience and what they need in the process.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And people are interested, yeah, definitely do some research there.
Yeah, there's a lot of
And I
organizations.
Yeah, and I know there's been like, lots of different debates. I mean, Joe and I have been, hearing a lot of different reports throughout the years. People report all sorts of stuff to us. And at one point we're like, what do we do? How do we like, handle all this stuff? And it's like, there's nowhere to maybe go. You're dealing with illegal substances, and then that adds this like whole layer of complexity to it. Is there like, I guess it's nice when things start to become a little bit above ground, right? There are boards that you can report stuff to, but I think in like the field, we've noticed like people have been kind of exiled for stuff. And like from your perspective, are there certain harms where like somebody should be exiled from this work? Or like, are there certain tiers? Like, something happened we could work with. This went beyond that. Maybe they shouldn't be doing this, or like, or do you think there's always a chance to like do healing work? And I think maybe from the psychedelic perspective, there could be, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a big question. Let me just sit with that for
Yeah.
a moment, see how I want to answer it. Yeah, there's a part of me that wants to say there's a line, and if you cross that line, you're out. And the thing I'm curious in my own system right now is like, is that my own internalization of the punitive justice system, of cancel culture? Probably yes, in some ways. And I also think that there's a space where if something has been repeated enough times, that someone does needs a serious break from being
Hmm.
able to do this. And so what I would say is that I don't think it's black and white.
Yeah.
I think that I want to tend towards a world where we're centered on transformation and healing, and that we believe in everybody's capacity to heal and change. And I think a specific aspect of this question is, how much power does this person have, and are they still in power?
Yeah.
And that if somebody has had an egregious violation, that they probably shouldn't be in a power position, my opinion, while they're going through the process of accountability, while they're going through their own work. And then they probably need a lot of support while they're coming back into the community, right? Like part of the restorative justice model is like, what is a route back to community? That doesn't necessarily mean the person gets to be in charge again, right? So there's a question of like kicking someone out of a community and taking away someone's power position while they're doing the accountability work that they need to do and the healing work that they need to do. Because I think that we need to have pretty strict ethics around who gets to be in power, how much integrity do those people have, and what kind of accountability do we hold them to in their own process of being in a leadership position, because being a leader is a great responsibility and a great privilege.
Yeah, yeah. I know it's a tricky thing, and I know we've explored like, there's definitely probably some people that maybe shouldn't be practicing right now, right?
Mhm,
Like
mhm.
they've done some really messed up things, but
Yeah.
could there be that possibility of like healing that happens? And maybe it comes back to, can people always heal, right? Like, we think about, oh, psychedelics, it will, you can heal, but sometimes that actually just, we talk about like ego dissolution, but also ego amplification, right?
Totally.
Inflation. And sometimes maybe you go down that healing path even more, and maybe your ego gets more inflamed and inflated.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah,
tricky thing. Yeah.
it is. With the way I hold it is that I have, well, not I want to, I actually have to believe that everyone is capable of healing on some level. That
Yeah.
doesn't mean everyone's going to do it,
Right.
right?
Right.
And that I think that there's an access issue there, and there's also, like you said, like some people just have structures where this isn't the work that they're going to do, and that's a choice that people are making. And that while we can hold, okay, this, we believe that you can do this, it doesn't mean that we have to exhaust resources over and over again giving someone support in their work. And again, I think there's a difference of kicking someone out of a community entirely and saying you need to take a break
Right.
from practicing, and we still care about you and you're still part of the community, but you need to take a break from
Yeah.
doing this thing
Yeah.
until you've done your work. Um, and again, these are dreams that I have for our future, and I think some aspects of our community are close to it, others are much further away from it. But it's not a perfect system, and it never will be. And it's mostly about like how do we join together and really support each other in
Hmm.
doing this differently than the way
Yeah.
that society has set us up to do it.
Yeah. I think like some of the things I've seen or some of the ideas that people were mentioning were like kind of creating the Yelps to some degree and like
Mhm.
kind of letting the community quote unquote vote on people, right? And say like
Yeah.
being able to report things in a community kind of forum and let people know that violations happened. And then maybe if enough people know that this is happening, they can quote unquote vote with their dollars, right? Just not being able to receive services from that person or, but yeah, I haven't seen anything like really take off the ground. I know like, I think it was psychedelicexperience.net. They had stuff around retreat centers and kind of like a little bit of a forum rating thing. And I know there were some other folks working on some stuff, but yeah, I mean, it's a big question, but then it also gets so complex when we're dealing with illegal substances, which, I think that's why I'm excited about legalization and bringing this stuff more above ground. Like it'll be really interesting to see if Oregon creates some sort of accountability thing, and to
Mhm.
some degree they probably will because they have licenses,
Yeah.
right? You have to be licensed to practice, but how do you, I guess you hold, I mean, the underground will continue to thrive. How do you hold the quote unquote legacy operators or underground operators accountable as well?
Mhm. Yeah, again, it's this really big question, right, of how do we do this? And that each system, I think, is gonna have to have a different iteration of their own accountability process. I'm in Portland, I'm in the Oregon system, and, right now, the only accountability system is reporting people to the OHA, the licensing body. We don't have another accountability system,
Right.
and I think we really need one. And, I've been in conversations with people about that, but it hasn't haven't had the resources to do that yet. And I think that it will have to develop in some way, and especially because when we look at accountability models, other licenses, like my therapist license, for example, the accountability structure in that is that someone can report me to my licensing board, but then the licensing board just deals with me. The person
Right.
who was harmed by me doesn't get any support. And that's a part of the restorative justice model that I really like and think that needs to be adopted here, of that we're caring for the people that are harmed. We're not just caring for the person that did the harm or figuring out some kind of punishment for the person that did the harm. Um, and there's different ways to do this. And again, like you said, the legacy folks, the underground folks, there's been so many accountability structures that have been attempted and worked out through the underground model. And that's going to continue. And we have to I think just work with this as we go and work with the resources that we have. And I think the hardest piece of this is coming together to do it in some
Yeah.
way and figuring out a system that we can all commit to, that the government and the regulational bodies are probably not going to do for us. And so this is more of a community norm and regulation, which, I think consent works the same way.
Yeah.
There's requirements around consent in the regulations, but it's not as deep as I would like to see it, at least. And so we have to hold each other accountable to that.
Right. So thinking about maybe more of these community models, and I know that you worked at APA and one of the co-founders, and thinking about creating national standards and maybe national boards, like, what's your take on national boards and organizations versus like smaller community kind of movements and organizations?
Yeah, I think that for the system that we're in right now, we need both. Um, I would love long term, that like my vision for the future is that we can kind of self-regulate within our more localized spaces, but I think the reality
Yeah.
is we're a long way off from that. And
Mm.
so, the way that the healthcare system works now is that it has to come national. There has to be a national body and then kind of state and local chapters of that. And that's something that, was part of the work that was part of the work I was doing at APA. And that within this system and this kind of space of bridging that I think many of us feel that we're in, is how do we attune to the system that we're currently working under while trying to usher in changes along the way. And I think this is one of them, of what does a national accountability structure look like a template for it, and then allowing and supporting and encouraging and empowering the smaller localized spaces to develop the one that really aligns with the community needs that they have. And that there can be really basic standards of care, standards of practice, ethical guidelines, accountability guidelines that are through a body like APA, and then knowing that those are going to be built upon based on wherever they're used. Practice guidelines are different than standards of practice, and they get more and more specific the closer you get to the actual care.
Yeah, makes sense. I want to go back to the conversation of touch. I'm just like noticing time, and I know that's probably like a huge topic,
Yeah.
especially within the psychedelic space. But it feels a little taboo at times too, right? It feels like we don't want to talk about it because a lot of harm has been done through touch, and maybe we don't talk about it or do any trainings around it because it feels a little taboo, especially as a therapist, right? Like, don't touch your clients. And we're starting to move in this more psychedelic model where I feel like sometimes having that handheld, where if we're thinking about like errors of omission, right? Maybe that might be really healing, maybe not, right? Really depends on the client. So yeah, why is it important to like talk about touch? How can people learn about it? And should touch, I know this is kind of like a lot of different opinions here. Should touch be included in psychedelic therapy services?
Yeah. That's a whole nother podcast, Kyle.
I know.
I'll do my
Well, we
best.
can come back and dig into it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna start with the last question you asked of should it be included. I think it should be offered. I think it should be on the table if the practitioner is okay with it, if it's within the practitioner's realm of consent to offer touch. Like that's the first boundary, and that's something that I talk about a lot in my training. Of that, there's we have hard boundaries and soft boundaries, and that the first layer of boundary is the practitioner's boundaries. Of that, if I'm not okay doing something, then it can't be on the table. Like I said before, if I cross my own boundaries, we're immediately outside of consent. So I think we need to, as practitioners, we need to think about what level of touch are we okay with. And if we're not okay with any touch with our clients, I would have some questions around working in the psychedelic field, to be honest. That's just my take. I'm sure other people will have different perspectives of that. But if you're not comfortable with just holding someone's hand, I think that there's a deeper questioning that needs to be addressed there. So I think that it should be at least offered on the table. And then the client gets to decide, is that a yes? Is that a no? Is that a negotiation? Like what level of boundary and consent are they at with it? And a part of that, my process around that comes from me being a trauma therapist. I'm a somatic trauma therapist. So, the body is very central to the work that I do. And And I specialize in working with people with complex PTSD. And so a lot of early developmental trauma are folks that I work with. And in my practice and, practices that I've learned from teachers and mentors and other people in the field, specifically with psychedelics, but also just outside of psychedelics and regular trauma therapy, of that people get into regress states pretty
Mm-hmm.
frequently. And oftentimes, like you said, those traumas of omission around touch, I think it could be unethical to not touch somebody if someone really needs that connection and if it's consented to ahead of time. And there's so many different ways to work with that. And I would say one of the kind of controversies around it that I know I've gotten into debates with people about, and it's a question that I get asked every single time I do a training, which is, what if someone says they don't want any touch and then you're in the medicine session and all of a sudden they're regressed and desperately need a hug? What do you do?
Mm.
And the response that I give to that is that we're not going to cross the boundaries that we agreed on, because consent can't be changed once you're under the influence of something. And there's a part of that client, this is my IFS parts work training coming in here. There's a part of that client that you've made a commitment to. And if you violate that, you've ruptured your relationship with them.
Right.
And so there's different ways to navigate that, of how do we hold this container and still meet the need of whatever's present for that client. I think it's really possible. And so, to come back, I think it needs to be on the table. And I think that there needs to be more training around it. I do this training, and I would say a majority of the training programs in the US right now. There are other people that do consent trainings that work around consent with psychedelics in the field, and there's not enough of us. Something that I really hold is that I would like my consent training to be boring for people. Like, I would like to get to the end of my class and have people be like, yep, we learned about consent again. But instead what happens is that I'm consistently flooded with emails of people saying how impactful it was, how like life-changing it was for them and their practice, because it's not something they've heard before. And that breaks my heart, because I think it should be normalized. And so I think that we need a lot more work around it as a field, as a collective, individually, and that it starts with people doing our own work of our relationship to consent, our relationship to touch in our own bodies and our own relationships, that then gets translated into our self of a facilitator and into the relationships with clients. So those are a long-winded answer, but yes, I think it should be on the
No,
table,
yeah,
and
it's
there's
great.
a lot of things to think about.
Well, and I want to go back to that statement that you mentioned around, like, if somebody's not comfortable with giving touch, like maybe kind of considering what you're doing. And I wonder if you could, if you're comfortable talking a little bit about your opinion there.
Yeah, yeah, I'm sure that's a controversial opinion to hear for some folks listening, and that's okay. It's just my opinion. You can take it or leave it. For me, and maybe I'll put a little bit of a qualifier on that, of that if you want to work with people that have a trauma history, um, that I think this is something that you need to at least be okay with having potentially having some kind of contact. And again, clients might not want it, which is totally fine. And then you're not going to be touching them if that is a hard boundary. But I think many people do need it and do want it. And I would be curious around like what the person's history with that is, and what's the scope of practice that then opens up if there needs or wants to be some kind of touch connected in that space. And that's not to say, like, I think that there's plenty of practitioners that work with people that don't ever touch their clients that do fantastic work.
Yeah.
I think that's really true. I would just say if there is a really rigid, strict, hard boundary in your system of I am never, ever touching a client in any possible way, like that level of rigidity, that's where I would have a curiosity of
Right.
what's in there, what's going on there, and what does that then mean for the kind of people you can work with based off of the needs that they might come in with in specifically this work, because touch is something that is so common, a need that comes up in these spaces.
Right. And I think just about like the mirroring effect. We can talk about like maybe mirror neurons, or I always think about something that Stan wrote about. I think it was in LSD psychotherapy, but the therapist, the guy, the facilitator really is kind of like the grounding rod for the person, and the client, the participant, as their boundaries are dissolving, they're using you as a way to test reality, right? And if you're crossing those boundaries, or you're confused about the boundaries, it's going to be really confusing. When I think about maybe somebody that is maybe regressing to a trauma and they're getting a very cold response because somebody might not want to touch, they just feel super uncomfortable with it. Yeah. How could that maybe perpetuate that, maybe like we'll call it like an abandonment trauma or a rejection trauma, right? And it's like then regressing even a bit more, and just thinking about how we are kind of mirrors to folks when their boundaries are dissolving, and the importance of really keeping those boundaries really intact too.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think a part of that, to just kind of continue on with that thread, is that I think a part of our work is about providing a corrective experience for people, and a corrective relational experience, often at that. And so if, we are that grounding rod, and we're also the thing that, accepts the projections from the people we're working with, and the projections mix with who we actually are, but both of those are always present. And that so much of this work relationally is, I'm going to hold that grounding rod. I'm going to hold the boundaries we've agreed to, and I'm still going to stay connected to you. And so much of trauma, especially early developmental trauma, traumas of omission, are about boundaries not being there, boundaries being too much there, neglect, abandonment, sexual abuse, like all of these things often come back to the caretaker or the person in that power position not being lined up and being a safe enough person for the child to interact with in a way that supports their development. And so if that's where someone's going back to, if we're going back to an experience of neglect as a child, we need that projection of the caregiver, which the facilitator is embodying, to be one that's really solid and that's going to hold the boundaries that we agreed to while staying open for connection and care, and not shutting down in the way that maybe the caregiver did if we're talking about a system of neglect.
Yeah.
And so that's a responsibility that we hold, and it's hard. It's not an easy thing to do.
I think one of my first lessons on boundaries was when I was working with teenagers, doing in crisis stabilization. And there was one person that came in particularly. Most of the teenagers that came in for a lot of suicidal ideation, self-harming behavior, and I feel like I'm more of the, I want to coddle you and take care of you and this and that. And my one supervisor was more of the hard line person. Mm-hmm. And this kid just kept I remember she's like, "You're the reason why I want to kill myself," just like projecting all this stuff. And I'm going, in my nature, I'm like, I'll sit down. I want to know what's going on with you. I want to, be that type of person. And I was getting triggered by the supervisor at the time of why do you need to be so harsh with this kid? They're coming, they're so traumatized. Can we give them a little bit more love? Why are you putting all these hard boundaries? No, this person needs it. And then I'm working with my own triggers because, maybe I relate to this person in some sense. And I'm like, no, but I just needed this. By the time that person left, they actually wrote a letter to that other supervisor and said, "Thank you so much for holding that hard boundary for me. My parents were my best friends. They let me do whatever I wanted to. And it felt like they never cared." Mm-hmm. And at that point I said, whoa, that actually was really helpful to learn. Sometimes you do need to hold those hard boundaries. And even though sometimes it might be really difficult, sometimes it actually is really good for the client, really depending on their situation, right? Maybe my supervisor at the time had an intuition about what was going on and really how to hold that. But I just remember working with my own stuff being like, oh, why are you treating this person so harshly? And then realizing it's actually what they really needed. And that was a big lesson for me. That was a really big lesson.
Yeah, that's it right there, right? That we need to hold the boundaries and provide people with that corrective experience. I mean, that was a corrective experience for that teenager. And, it mirrors to the example I gave earlier of what if someone says no touch at all during the session, and we get into the session and, oh my God, they desperately need a hug. Right. Yeah. We then have the opportunity to model that corrective experience of, I'm going to hold the boundaries that we agreed to, because I don't want to violate my agreement with the part of you that needed that boundary, even if that part is now offline, because psychedelics often take these protector parts offline, or they get reduced, or more openness, right? Or the trauma is able to come out. I'm going to hold this boundary, and I'm going to stay connected to you. I'm going to invite you, as there's self-touch that you can do. Can I give you a weighted blanket? Can I put a pillow on top of your chest and then put some pressure on the pillow? Right? What are all the array of options that I can give you that allow us to stay connected while I'm holding this boundary? Can we just sit with how much you want this touch right now and experience the feeling of that and know that we're going to talk about it in integration? And if we do another medicine session, we can change our boundaries then. But really, like, helping that titration of the nervous system of the trauma that's coming up and staying steady, I think is really like that ground where big corrective relational experiences can happen. And they're uncomfortable. They often
Hmm.
mean our clients are mad at us, they're frustrated. And if we can hold that space and stay connected, I've seen a lot of transformation on the other side.
Yeah, I mean, just that example of like this kid just, mentioning, you're the reason why I want to kill myself, and it's like, that's a hard thing to hear,
Oh, yeah.
that projection, and to hold that line still and say, no, you actually need this boundary. And I just love the fact that you brought up like these alternatives to touch,
Mhm.
weighted blanket, a pillow. Can somebody do their own touch? Right. When I'm talking about body work, I'm telling people you can do this yourself. Sometimes you actually just need somebody, you need the leverage of another body to maybe push against, otherwise you can do most of this stuff yourself in some way. And I want to talk just briefly about like maybe the way we frame touch, as in something that a facilitator or practitioner does to somebody
Mhm.
versus it being more of a supportive process for the person, right? Because I think so many times, and I notice this when we talk about body work, or I've been in modules about teaching body work, people are so curious around the technique. Teach me how to do this. What do I need to do to somebody if X, Y, and Z comes up? Versus taking a kind of a different approach of like the doing, not doing framework, and thinking about, how can I just support this person through their process, instead of thinking I need to actually go in and do X, Y, and Z, versus what does this person need and how can I just support that? And I think that's a really important kind of like reframe for people that are, doing this work and are doing touch, right? Because sometimes
Yeah.
there is that like nature of like, oh, I want to put my hand on this person to give them that. But
Mhm.
it's like, maybe that's not what they need, right?
Yeah. Yeah, the question that, from my touch and consent lineage of the wheel of consent that really embodies that is the question of who is this for? And when I'm doing my trainings, I tell people, if you don't take anything from this, just take this question, who is this for? And slow down enough until you can really answer that question. And if it's for you, the facilitator, then you need to stop, right? And really reassess, because you are in a place of being in service. And this is part of the quadrants from the wheel of consent, but you are in the serve quadrant, which means that it's not for you. You are taking the action, but it's not for you. It's for the person who is receiving this action, receiving the gift in Benny Martin language. But exactly what you're saying, the doing, not doing from the breathwork world, I think is similar to this, who is it for? And that we're there as something for someone to act something out with. And it's a co-created process. It's not something we're doing to somebody, but rather a way that we're being in service to somebody else's process.
Yeah. And thinking about like, who is this for? And then like, how is this triggering me? Why is this triggering me?
Yeah. Yep.
Another kind of personal example was when we were doing a workshop, there was somebody, they were verbally singing a swear word. And in my mind, I'm like, I need to tell this person to stop, you know? And I, was sitting with it and, trying to listen to my own advice and saying, well, why am I annoyed right now? Oh, I'm actually anxious that this is disrupting the whole group. I'm anxious that people are going to be mad that I didn't step in. And, I think this is like really nice to be able to work in groups. I checked in with other facilitator and was like, should we tell this person to stop, singing, and it's really, again, coming back to who is this for? Oh, this is actually for me, because I'm more worried that people are going to hate me right now that I let this go.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
And we let it go, we just let the person do their thing. And some people said, oh, thank you so much. Like, you actually helped me get in touch with X, Y, and Z. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's really important. Who's this for? Thank you.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And that the who is this for question also brings up that we often want to do things that are for us, right? In this space, part of being a really consent oriented practitioner is being radically honest about our own stuff that comes in the room, and that we want to be helpful. I want to do something. I've been sitting here for 4 hours and haven't done anything. And I want to do something, right? But that's for me and for my own benefit. And so part of the co-constructed nature of this work and of the consent arrangements is knowing that we don't know what's going on for the person and that we need to be really clear and that we are in service. This is for the other person and that we are never going to know exactly what's going on in someone else's system and someone else's journey. And so we have to trust that relational space and the safe enough container that we come up with.
Yeah. How do we trust that? Like, do you have any
A lot of work.
techniques for that? A lot of,
It's different. I think so much of it is about the relationship between facilitator and clients, participants, group, retreat participants, whoever you're working with. And for me, at least, it's a somatic cue. I think so much of this work needs to be done in relationship with our bodies. And part of the consent checklist I teach is assessing a client's relationship to yes and to no, and how that might come up in the relationship between facilitator and client. And that there is a kind of somatic resonance of when someone is embodied in their yes, in their no. And it's different for each person's body. And I have my own cues in the co-regulation space of where I'm attuned to the person, of what it feels like for me to say, I trust this person enough to tell me yes, to tell me no, that we can work this through to go into this. And so there's trust on my side as well as the trust of the client having to trust me. And so I think it's different for everybody. I think we need to, part of our work, I think as a collective, and especially in this space, is really tuning into what are my body's cues that it's okay to go into this? What are my body's cues that something is off? Or there's something that doesn't feel okay, right? That gut instinct that shows up differently for different people. And I think it's part of our responsibility to learn that in our own system in order to navigate this space that is so often, full of stuff that we're not trained how to deal with in our regular development process in the society.
Yeah, somatic attunement and then discernment as well. How do we discern
Exactly.
that information that's coming in? It's like really interesting stuff. How do you teach that to somebody? I think about this all the time.
Yeah. And we can't teach it intellectually, that's for sure, right? This is
Yeah.
an embodied process. And I think about a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, that often says, "What's the difference between your intuition and your trauma response?"
Yeah, that's another good one.
And that we have to learn the difference between those two things because they often sound really similar and feel really similar in our systems. And so I think how we teach this stuff is having people sit with themselves, having people do their own work, having people really be somatically oriented. I think about I've been a part of the somatic abolitionism community, and I've done the training a couple of times with Resma Menachem and Carlin Quinn. And so much of that work is about tracking your somatic experience in relationship to racialized trauma. But I think it is a model that can be used for this work too, of getting in touch with what our body experiences and then how to make decisions from that point with that discernment that we all have to develop.
Yeah, and to add like another layer, kind of bringing in psychedelic experiences, how do we discern that information when the psychedelic is involved and somebody's going through their experience and they get a certain message? Right. So maybe, we're thinking about facilitators that may dose with their clients. It might be a low dose, right? But they get this intuitive download, or the medicine's telling me X, Y, and Z. And, is that always valid? Should you always listen to that? Do you know what your yes and no are without medicine first? And I think these are...
And what are, with people who practice in that way and people who take medicine or not, right? If we're practicing from a place of my intuition is helping me in this process, of what is your ethical framework for checking that? And is that an ethical framework that is clear to you ahead of time? Of that, I think that people who work that way, and I'm one of them, like my intuition comes into how I work, of that we need to have a set of steps, right? And the who is this for is part of that question. Because oftentimes we can have those intuitive hits, or it could be our trauma response that's coming up, and it might be for us. Right. And what is this in service to? I think is a question and the relationship with the person we're working with is so critical in that space too.
Yeah. Well, this has been awesome. It's such an important conversation to be having. So I really appreciate your time and all your wisdom that you're sharing with us. I
Yeah, of
noticed that
course.
we're getting at time. I feel like we could go on for another hour or so. For those that are like really curious about learning about consent or touch, do you have any? It
Mhm.
sounds like you do trainings around consent, but do you have
Mhm.
any recommendations? Could be your own if you're doing that publicly, or any other
Yeah,
resources.
I offer the trainings publicly sometimes. Most of my trainings are housed within training programs. I also wrote a book chapter that has all of the protocols for all of the consent practices that I train people on. So you can check that out. It's in the book, Integral Psychedelic Therapy. And I'm forgetting, I think it's chapter 12, but I'm not,
Is
I
that
can't
with
remember.
Jason's and
Genesee
Genesee?
Hesberg and Jason Butler are the editors of that.
Nice.
And so I have a chapter in that book that's got all the
Cool.
consent protocols. So people can check that out. If you're looking for like robust consent training, I would recommend Betty Martin's work on the Wheel of Consent. And there's an organization called the School of Consent that has a wonderful trainings. And it's not psychedelic specific, but I think it's very applicable to the psychedelic world. Um, yeah, those would be my big recommendations. There's a organization out of Seattle called the Consent Academy that does a lot of basics around consent. Um, but not there's not a whole lot yet around psychedelics and consent. We're working on building that out.
What about touch? Is touch sometimes wrapped up in this in some of these consent trainings, or is there a specific touch training that you know of that could be really helpful?
Yeah, so the Wheel of Consent does have a touch
Okay,
component of it, and
cool.
so that's really baked in there. And then, there's lots of different trainings for touch in practitioner settings, but I would say in terms of touch and consent, the Wheel of Consent I is the one I would recommend the highest.
Cool. Awesome. Anything that you personally want to close with? Any final thoughts or anything that
Mm. I think the last thing I would say is that so much of this work, with consent and touch in psychedelics is about knowing ourselves, and that we really have to do the work of self consent, of knowing our body, of how consent moves in our relationship with other people. And that then informs our ability to be a really consent oriented practitioner. Um, I think so many aspects of being a psychedelic practitioner require us to do our own work. But I would just really encourage people to not take the route of fragmenting our facilitator self from our normal self, of that these things need to flow between them, and that also that you're going to mess up, you're going to make mistakes, there's going to be people that are harmed by you, and that taking accountability, moving towards repair, and doing your work and being in community around it is the most important thing we can do.
I think that's a really important reminder. We're all human. We're all going to mess up, and we're all going to make mistakes. But I guess
Mhm.
just having the courage to confront that and acknowledge
Mhm.
it. So, yeah, thanks for that reminder.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And if people are curious to learn more about you, do you have a website or an online presence?
I have a website. It's emmaknighton.com. I don't do the professional social media thing. So if people want to find me,
Smart.
go to my website. Yeah.
Cool. Emma, well, thank you so much again. This has been a real joy and pleasure. And thank you for sharing all your wisdom with us today.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. This was great.